The fluorescent lights of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport hummed overhead like mechanical heartbeats, casting harsh shadows across Terminal 4's polished floors. Business travelers clutched their phones, tourists dragged oversized suitcases, and families navigated the maze of departure gates with practiced efficiency. The morning rush was routine, predictable, just another day in America's busiest airport until Ranger's bark shattered the illusion of normalcy. It wasn't the disciplined alert of a trained canine officer. It was something primal, urgent, desperate. The Belgian Malinois pulled against his leash with such force that Officer Daniel Carter nearly lost his footing, his coffee cup clattering to the ground as the dog's powerful muscles tensed beneath his tactical harness. Ranger's ears were pinned back, his amber eyes locked onto something that made every hair on his neck stand like tiny soldiers at attention. In his 7 years of service, through bomb, threats, drug seizures, and countless security sweeps, Carter had never seen his partner react with such raw intensity. The dog's nostrils flared as he processed scents invisible to human senses, his training warring with an instinct that ran deeper than commands, deeper than protocol. Something was wrong, terribly, dangerously wrong. And in the sea of faces moving through Terminal 4, Ranger had found it. The passport scanner's green light flickered, then died. In its place, a crimson warning blazed across the screen like digital blood. Invalid child passport. Carter's hands trembled as he read the details scrolling past, each line more damning than the last. Real name, Eli Maro. Nationality, French. Status, missing, 73 days. The professional composure he'd maintained throughout his career cracked like ice under pressure as he stared at the man in the expensive suit, still seated calmly in the interrogation room, still checking his watch as if this were merely an inconvenient delay. But it was the boy who haunted Carter's vision, the 5-year-old with hollow eyes who hadn't spoken a word, who clutched his teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Through the one-way mirror, Thomas Whitman adjusted his tie with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to having documents that opened every door, money that silenced every question. He had no idea that his perfectly constructed lie was unraveling, thread by thread, because of a dog who had refused to stay silent. Ranger sat motionless outside the door, his breathing steady but his ears still alert, as if he could smell the evil that expensive cologne and forged papers couldn't mask. In 73 days, a mother in France had screamed her son's name into an empty void. Tonight, because one dog had dared to disobey the indifference of a system that protected the powerful, that silence was finally about to be broken. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. In the shadowed corridors of international crime, where money flows like water and children disappear like smoke, there exists a truth that chills law enforcement officers to their core. The most heinous predators often wear the finest suits. They speak multiple languages, carry diplomatic immunity, and navigate legal systems with the precision of surgeons cutting through red tape. These are not the stereotypical villains of television dramas, but sophisticated operators who exploit the very institutions designed to protect the innocent. Today's story unfolds in the sterile halls of Atlanta's International Airport, where the constant hum of jet engines masks the silent screams of the vulnerable, and where a single moment of canine intuition would expose a web of corruption that stretched across 3 continents. Officer Daniel Carter had spent 15 years in law enforcement, the last 7 partnered with Ranger, AEE, Belgian Malinois, whose reputation preceded him through every precinct in Georgia. Together, they had intercepted millions of dollars in narcotics, prevented terrorist attacks, and earned commendations that lined Carter's office walls like battle scars. But nothing in their combined experience had prepared them for the evil that would walk through Terminal 4 on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, disguised as respectability and armed with documents that had cost more than most people's homes. The international adoption industry, worth billions globally, operates in shadows where desperate parents meet opportunistic facilitators, where legitimate agencies work alongside criminal networks that view children as commodities to be traded across borders. In this twilight world, a forged signature can transform kidnapping into legal guardianship, and a well-placed bribe can turn a missing child into an adoption success story. The man who would soon face Ranger's unwavering stare had perfected this dark art, using his credentials as a security consultant to access the highest levels of government bureaucracy, corrupting officials who signed papers without asking questions, and exploiting a system that prioritized efficiency over scrutiny. But evil, no matter how sophisticated, carries a scent that trained nostrils can detect, a frequency of fear that sensitive ears can hear. And on this morning, in Terminal 4, a dog's instinct would prove more reliable than any database, more accurate than any background check, more powerful than any legal document forged in the fires of human greed. The morning light streaming through Terminal 4's massive windows created a kaleidoscope of shadows that danced across the polished granite floors, but Ranger's attention was laser-focused on something far more sinister than the play of light and darkness. His powerful haunches coiled like springs as he tracked a scent that spoke to instincts older than civilization, older than training, older than the badge that gleamed on Carter's uniform. The Belgian Malinois had been bred for war, his bloodline tracing back through generations of dogs who had served in trenches and battlefields, who had learned to distinguish between the scent of courage and the acrid smell of evil. Now, in the antiseptic environment of America's busiest airport, those ancient instincts were screaming warnings that his human partner was only beginning to understand. Thomas Whitman moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator who had learned to blend seamlessly into civilized society. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor in a measured rhythm, his charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, and his smile carried the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being trusted by strangers. But beside him, like a shadow given human form, walked a 5-year-old boy whose silence spoke volumes that no adult seemed willing to hear. Eli's light brown hair fell across eyes that had seen too much, understood too little, and feared everything. His cartoon T-shirt, bright with primary colors that should have represented joy and innocence, instead seemed like a costume poorly fitted to a child who had forgotten how to be young. The teddy bear clutched against his chest was worn from desperate embraces, its fabric darkened by tears that had dried without comfort, its button eyes reflecting a sadness that made seasoned airport security guards look away rather than confront the questions it raised. Carter felt Ranger's muscles tense beneath his palm, the dog's body language shifting from routine patrol to high alert with an intensity that made the officer's own adrenaline spike. In 7 years of partnership, through countless operations that had tested their bond under fire, Carter had learned to read his canine companion like a book written in a language only they shared. Ranger's ears swiveled forward, his nostrils flared with rapid, shallow breaths, and his amber eyes locked onto the man and child with a focus that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight into souls. The dog's training warred with something deeper, something that connected him to that silent child in ways that transcended commands and protocol. And in that moment of recognition, the first thread in Thomas Whitman's carefully woven deception began to unravel. The bark that erupted from Ranger's throat was unlike anything Carter had heard in their 7 years together, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of normalcy and expose something raw and desperate beneath. It wasn't the controlled alert that signaled drugs or explosives, nor the warning growl that preceded an arrest. This was pure canine anguish, a cry that spoke of innocence in danger and evil, walking free under fluorescent lights. The sound echoed through Terminal 4 like a gunshot, causing heads to turn and conversations to halt as hundreds of travelers suddenly became aware that something was terribly wrong in their midst. Carter's coffee cup hit the ground in slow motion, the dark liquid splashing across his polished boots as Ranger lunged forward with such force that the leather leash burned against the officer's palm. The Belgian Malinois, 70 pounds of muscle and instinct, pulled toward the man in the expensive suit with single-minded determination, his paws scrambling for purchase on the smooth granite as his entire body vibrated with tension that seemed ready to snap, like an overstretched wire. Thomas Whitman's head turned at the commotion, his pale blue eyes meeting Carter's across 20 feet of crowded concourse, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his practiced smile, something cold and calculating that made the officer's skin crawl. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the perfect mask of concerned cooperation that had served him well in previous encounters with law enforcement. The child beside him remained motionless, his small fingers white-knuckled around the teddy bear's threadbare fur, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground, as if making eye contact might shatter whatever fragile protection his silence provided. Carter approached with the measured steps of a predator who sensed prey but wasn't yet ready to pounce, his hand instinctively checking the radio clipped to his shoulder, feeling the reassuring weight of his service weapon against his hip. Ranger's growl had subsided to a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the dog's entire body, a subsonic warning that spoke of barely controlled violence, held in check only by years of disciplined training. The crowd around them had begun to give the scene a wide berth, parents pulling their children closer, business travelers clutching their briefcases tighter, everyone sensing that they were witnessing something significant but not yet understanding what. "Excuse me, sir." Carter's voice carried the authoritative tone he'd perfected over 15 years in law enforcement, calm but unmistakably commanding. "Would you mind stopping for a moment?" The words hung in the recycled air, like a challenge thrown down between adversaries who had not yet declared their intentions, while Ranger continued to stare at the child with an intensity that suggested he saw something in those hollow eyes that the human world had chosen to ignore. Thomas Whitman's response came with the fluid precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in mirrors and hotel rooms. Across 3 continents, his voice carrying just the right blend of surprise and cooperation that marked him as either genuinely innocent or devastatingly skilled at deception. "Is there a problem, officer?" The slight European accent added an air of sophistication that seemed to legitimize his presence in this sterile corridor of international transit, while his manicured fingers moved with practiced efficiency toward the leather briefcase that contained his carefully constructed identity. The EE documents emerged like playing cards dealt by a master gambler, each one perfectly positioned to tell the story he needed told. United States passport bearing the name Thomas Robert Whitman, adoption papers sealed with the official embossment of a Texas family court, custody arrangements typed on letterhead that had cost more than most people earned in a month. Every signature was authentic because the officials who had signed them were real, corrupted by money that flowed through accounts in Luxembourg and Dubai, purchased with the kind of precision that turned government bureaucrats into unwitting accomplices. But while the papers spoke of legitimacy, Ranger's continued agitation told a different story entirely, his amber eyes never leaving the child who stood frozen beside this man, like a statue carved from fear and silence. Carter examined each document with the methodical attention of someone who had seen forgeries sophisticated enough to fool federal databases, his trained eye, searching for the subtle imperfections that marked even the most professional fabrications. The custody order bore the raised seal of Judge Patricia Williamson, a name Carter recognized from news reports about judicial corruption that had rocked the Texas legal system 2 years earlier, though those connections wouldn't become clear until much later. The child's passport identified him as Ethan Whitman, adopted son, born in Dallas, but something about the photograph seemed wrong in ways that Carter couldn't immediately articulate, a subtle wrongness that spoke to instincts trained through years of examining false identities and manufactured histories. Meanwhile, Eli remained silent, his small body rigid with the kind of tension that children develop when they've learned that any movement, any sound, any sign of life might trigger consequences too terrible to imagine. His teddy bear had become more than a comfort object. It was a shield, a barrier between himself and a world that had shown him cruelty disguised as care, adults who spoke kindly while planning horrors that defied comprehension. The bear's button eyes seemed to reflect the fluorescent lights like tiny black mirrors, witnessing everything, judging nothing, offering the only constant in a reality that had been twisted beyond recognition by men in expensive suits who treated children like commodities to be traded across international borders. Ranger's low growl continued to rumble through his chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the terminal's steel and concrete structure, reaching frequencies that only other predators could fully understand. The secondary inspection room reeked of industrial disinfectant and buried secrets, its beige walls scarred by years of interrogations that had peeled away carefully constructed lies layer by layer until only truth remained, naked and shivering under unforgiving fluorescent lights. Carter guided Thomas Whitman and the boy down the sterile corridor with the measured pace of a funeral procession, each footstep echoing against polished concrete that had absorbed the confessions of smugglers, terrorists, and human traffickers who had underestimated the persistence of American law enforcement. Ranger padded silently beside them, his tactical harness creaking with each controlled breath, his amber eyes never wavering from the child who moved like a ghost haunting his own life. The inspection room's one-way mirror reflected their small procession like a distorted family portrait painted in shades of deception and fear, while hidden cameras recorded every micro-expression, every nervous gesture, every tell that would later be analyzed by behavioral specialists trained to read the grammar of guilt written in human movement. Whitman settled into the metal chair with the casual confidence of a man who had survived similar encounters in airports across Europe and Asia, his expensive suit a armor of respectability that had protected him from suspicion in a dozen countries where his credentials opened doors and his money silenced questions. But the boy remained standing, clutching his teddy bear with fingers that seemed permanently curved around its worn fabric, his light brown hair falling across eyes that had learned to see without looking, to hear without listening, to exist without truly living. Carter positioned himself across the narrow table, his notebook open to a fresh page that would soon be filled with the details of a story more horrific than any fiction, while Ranger settled beside the door like a four-legged sentinel, guarding against escape routes that existed more in the mind than in the physical world. The silence that filled the room carried weight, pressing down on all present with the accumulated pressure of 73 days of unanswered prayers, desperate searches, and a mother's screams echoing across an ocean that seemed suddenly too vast to cross. Female officer Sarah Martinez entered with the gentle movements of someone trained to work with traumatized children, her voice pitched to the frequency of safety and comfort as she knelt beside Eli and offered him a bottle of water that he accepted with hands that trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. But when she asked his name, when she smiled with genuine warmth and spoke in tones designed to reassure rather than interrogate, the boy's response was silence so complete it seemed to drain sound from the room itself, creating a vacuum where words should have lived, but fear had murdered them before they could be born. The crayons scattered across the metal table like fallen soldiers, their bright colors a stark contrast to the institutional gray that dominated the interrogation room's sterile atmosphere. Social worker Emily Hayes had arrived with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years coaxing truth from children whose voices had been stolen by adults who should have protected them. Her canvas bag filled with tools, designed to unlock doors that trauma had sealed shut. She placed the paper before Eli, with movements so gentle they seemed choreographed to avoid startling a creature who had learned that sudden gestures preceded pain, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who understood that children spoke in languages older than words, deeper than vocabulary. The first drawing emerged slowly, hesitantly, as if Eli's small fingers were translating thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud into images. That might be safer to share. A dog appeared under his careful strokes, its ears alert, its tail raised in the universal canine expression of vigilance and protection, followed by an airplane that seemed to carry more weight than any aircraft should bear, its wings stretching across the paper like a mechanical bird of prey. But it was the third figure that made everyone in the room hold their breath, a human shape with large, hollow eyes and straight, severe eyebrows that captured something essential about fear made manifest in human form. Thomas Whitman shifted in his chair for the first time since entering the room, the leather of his expensive shoes creaking against the linoleum floor as he watched his carefully constructed facade being dismantled by a child's honest art. Emily's training had taught her to read these visual confessions like scripture, understanding that traumatized children often communicated through symbols and metaphors that bypassed the conscious mind's protective barriers and spoke directly from wounded souls to anyone willing to listen with their hearts instead of their heads. When she pointed to the figure with the hollow eyes and asked gently if it represented him, Eli's nod was barely perceptible, a movement so small it might have been mistaken for a shiver, if not for the way his grip tightened on the teddy bear until his knuckles went white with strain. The room seemed to contract around that single gesture, the walls closing in on a truth that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by expensive suits and forged documents, but ultimately vulnerable to the devastating honesty of a child who had nothing left to lose except the last fragments of his innocence. Ranger, still positioned by the door like a furry guardian angel, lifted his head at that moment, as if he could smell the shift in emotional temperature, his amber eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like twin flames of justice burning in the darkness of human cruelty. The question that followed hung in the recycled air like a sword suspended over all their heads. And this man, is he your daddy? The silence that preceded Eli's response lasted only seconds, but felt like centuries, pregnant with the weight of 73 days of separation, fear, and a mother's unanswered prayers echoing across an ocean of bureaucratic indifference. The word "no" escaped Eli's lips, like a ghost finally given permission to speak, so soft it barely disturbed the recycled air, but carrying enough force to shatter the carefully constructed reality that Thomas Whitman had spent months building with forged documents and corrupted officials. It hung in the sterile atmosphere of the interrogation room, like a confession torn from the depths of a soul that had been forced into silence for 73 endless days, each one a small eternity of fear and confusion that no 5-year-old should ever have to endure. Carter felt his heart stop for a moment, then restart with a rhythm that seemed to echo the word that had just changed everything, while Emily Hayes closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, recognizing the sound of truth finally breaking free from the prison where it had been held captive by threats and manipulation. Thomas Whitman's composure cracked like ice under pressure, his pale blue eyes darting between the child and the adults who were beginning to understand the magnitude of the deception that had walked so boldly through international security checkpoints, protected by nothing more substantial than expensive clothing and the assumption that monsters didn't wear Italian leather shoes. The teddy bear in Eli's arms seemed to absorb the tremor that ran through his small body as he spoke that single syllable of defiance, its button eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like tiny witnesses to a moment that would be remembered in courtrooms and case files for years to come. Ranger rose from his position by the door with movements that spoke of barely contained violence, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his dark coat as he approached the child with steps so careful they seemed choreographed to avoid frightening someone who had already been frightened beyond measure. The Belgian Malinois lowered his massive head until his snout rested gently against Eli's leg, offering the kind of comfort that transcended species barriers and spoke to something fundamental about protection and loyalty that existed in the space between. Heartbeats. For the first time since entering the airport terminal, Eli smiled, a fragile expression that transformed his hollow features into something recognizably human, recognizably childlike, recognizably worth saving from the sophisticated evil that had tried to erase his identity and replace it with a fiction written in forged ink and sealed with corrupted authority. The smile lasted only seconds, but illuminated the room like sunrise after the longest night, revealing the boy who still existed beneath layers of trauma and fear, waiting to be rescued by adults who finally understood that listening to children sometimes meant hearing words they whispered instead of shouted, truths they drew instead of spoke, and realities they lived instead of described. Emily's voice carried new urgency as she leaned closer to Eli, her professional training warring with maternal instincts that made her want to gather this damaged child in her arms and carry him away from everything that had hurt him. But she maintained the careful distance that protocol demanded, while her heart broke for the innocence that money and corruption had tried to purchase like any other commodity. The computer screen's crimson warning blazed like digital fire across the biometric verification system, each line of data that scrolled past serving as another nail in the coffin of Thomas Whitman's elaborate deception. Carter's hands trembled as he read the devastating details that painted a picture of calculated evil disguised as legal adoption. Real name Eli Maro, French nationality, reported missing by his biological mother in Marseille exactly 73 days ago, flagged in Interpol databases across 17 countries where desperate law enforcement agencies had been searching for a ghost that walked through airports protected by forged papers and corrupted officials. The man who had presented himself as a loving adoptive father was revealed to be something far more sinister, a predator who had weaponized the international adoption system to legitimize kidnapping on a scale that chilled even seasoned investigators who thought they had seen every variation of human evil. In the interrogation room, separated from this digital revelation by nothing more than a thin wall and a one-way mirror, Whitman continued to project the calm confidence of someone who believed his money had purchased immunity from consequences, his manicured fingers drumming against the metal table in a rhythm that suggested boredom rather than the desperate anxiety of a criminal whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. But Eli's whispered admission had already begun the process of unraveling, that would eventually expose a network of corruption that reached from Texas courthouses to European banking institutions, from child welfare agencies to diplomatic missions where officials had been purchased like office supplies and deployed to rubber-stamp atrocities that defied both law and human decency. Emily Hayes continued her gentle interrogation, each question designed to extract information without re-traumatizing a child who had already endured more psychological damage than most adults experienced in entire lifetimes. Her voice maintaining the musical cadence of safety even as her professional instincts screamed warnings about the sophistication of the criminal enterprise that had targeted this innocent boy. When she asked about his mother, Eli's response came in fragments, broken pieces of memory that painted a picture of deliberate psychological manipulation designed to convince a 5-year-old that his entire world had been erased and replaced with a new reality where resistance was futile and silence was survival. Ranger remained pressed against the child's leg like a furry anchor to sanity, his warm presence offering the kind of unconditional protection that Eli had been denied for over 2 months of captivity disguised as care, his steady breathing providing a rhythm of safety in a world that had taught the boy to expect cruelty from every adult who claimed to have his best interests at heart. Outside the interrogation room, Carter was coordinating with federal agencies whose databases were painting an increasingly horrific picture of international child trafficking disguised as legitimate adoption services, each new piece of information adding weight to charges that would eventually put Thomas Whitman behind bars for the rest of his natural life. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team descended on Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport like federal angels of vengeance, their black SUVs cutting through traffic with emergency lights that painted the afternoon sky in shades of urgent justice. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez had been tracking patterns of suspicious international adoptions for 3 years, following digital breadcrumbs that led through offshore banking accounts, corrupt judicial signatures, and forged documentation that had allowed predators to move children across borders like human cargo. The case file that landed on her desk that afternoon contained photographs of Thomas Whitman that matched surveillance images from airports in Brussels, Dubai, and Bangkok, always traveling with different children, always carrying documents that passed cursory inspection but crumbled under serious scrutiny. The sophisticated network that Whitman represented operated in the shadows between legitimate international adoption agencies and outright human trafficking rings, exploiting legal gray areas and bureaucratic inefficiencies to transform kidnapping into paperwork, terror into custody agreements, and stolen children into profitable transactions. Rodriguez's team had been mapping this criminal enterprise for months, identifying patterns that suggested at least 17 children had been moved through similar channels, their true identities erased, and replaced with fictional histories that served the twisted desires of wealthy clients who viewed childhood innocence as a commodity to be purchased rather than protected. In the airport's secure communication center, encrypted messages flew between Atlanta and Interpol headquarters in Lyon, France, where Claire Maro's missing person report had gathered dust in filing cabinets that overflowed with similar cases of children who had vanished into systems designed more to protect perpetrators than victims. The photograph that appeared on Rodriguez's tablet screen showed a young French woman with Eli's same light brown hair and hollow eyes, her face etched with the kind of grief that came from having the most precious thing in her life stolen by people who possessed the resources to make law enforcement agencies look the other way. Claire had spent every penny of her modest savings hiring private investigators who had followed false leads across 3 countries, bribing clerks for information that led nowhere, sleeping in her car outside courthouses where corrupt judges had sealed adoption records that didn't exist in any legitimate database. Her story was a familiar one in the files that Rodriguez reviewed. Single mothers from working-class backgrounds whose children disappeared into legal labyrinths designed to favor those with money, connections, and the sophisticated knowledge needed to exploit international adoption laws that varied wildly between countries and created opportunities for criminals who understood bureaucracy better than the officials who were supposed to enforce it. The emergency custody order that would return Eli to his mother was already being processed by federal magistrates who had been briefed on the scope of the criminal network that Whitman's arrest had exposed. But Rodriguez knew that saving one child was only the beginning of unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government agencies in multiple countries. The chartered aircraft that carried Claire Moreau across the Atlantic moved through darkness like a steel prayer answered after 73 days of desperate pleading with a universe that had seemed determined to ignore her screams for justice. She pressed her face against the small window, watching city lights blur past below while her heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that matched the jet engine's steady roar, each mile bringing her closer to a son she had begun to fear she would never hold again. The emergency visa that had been processed in record time bore stamps from agencies that normally moved with glacial bureaucratic slowness, but the FBI's intervention had transformed months of red tape into hours of coordinated international cooperation that proved what was possible when powerful institutions decided to prioritize human decency over procedural convenience. In Atlanta, the Family Reunification Center had been prepared with the clinical efficiency of a military operation, its comfortable rooms designed to ease the transition for children who had been traumatized by separations that defied comprehension, its staff trained to recognize the signs of psychological damage that came from being told your entire world had been erased and replaced with a manufactured reality. Eli sat in a corner chair, still clutching his teddy bear while Ranger rested beside him like a furry guardian angel whose presence had become the only constant in a life that had been turned inside out by adults who treated children like objects to be traded rather than souls to be protected. Emily Hayes had spent hours preparing him for this moment, using gentle words and careful explanations to help his damaged psyche understand that the nightmare was ending, that the mother he had been told was dead was actually alive and flying across an ocean to reclaim him from the sophisticated evil that had stolen 73 days of their shared life. The reunion itself happened in slow motion, a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, as Claire's voice calling his name cut through the sterile air of the reunification center like a sword of love, slicing through barriers that money and corruption had erected around her child. Eli's head lifted with movements that seemed to require tremendous effort, his hollow eyes focusing with difficulty on the woman whose face had haunted his dreams, even as Whitman's psychological manipulation had tried to convince him that she was nothing more than a ghost from a life that had never really existed. The recognition that dawned in his features was like watching sunrise after the longest night, his small body suddenly animated by hope that had been buried beneath layers of fear and confusion, his legs carrying him across the room with steps that grew stronger with each stride toward the arms that had ached to hold him for over 2 months of separation. The embrace that followed contained within it all the tears that hadn't been allowed to fall, all the words that hadn't been permitted to be spoken, all the love that had been denied expression by criminals who had tried to erase the bonds between mother and child, as if such connections could be severed with forged documents and false promises. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta stood like a granite monument to justice delayed but not denied, its classical columns casting long shadows across steps that had witnessed the downfall of corruption. Networks spanning multiple continents, and countless victims whose voices had finally found their way into courtrooms where truth mattered more than money. Thomas Whitman sat in the defendant's chair with his hands cuffed behind his back, the expensive suit that had once served as armor against suspicion, now wrinkled and stained with the sweat of a man who had finally run out of documents to forge, officials to bribe, and children to steal from mothers who had been deemed unworthy of protection by systems designed to favor predators with resources. The evidence presented by federal prosecutors painted a picture of calculated evil that reached beyond individual crimes into the systematic exploitation of international adoption laws that had been written with good intentions but implemented with bureaucratic indifference, that created opportunities for sophisticated criminals to traffic children across borders with impunity. Claire Maro took the witness stand with quiet dignity that transformed the courtroom into a cathedral of truth, her voice steady as she described 73 days of being dismissed by authorities who suggested she was overreacting, being emotional, being foreign, being poor, being everything except someone whose child had been stolen by a network of criminals who specialized in making victims disappear into legal gray areas where money spoke louder than maternal desperation. Her testimony revealed the systematic nature of Whitman's operation, how he, had targeted single mothers from working-class backgrounds whose limited resources made them vulnerable to institutional indifference, how he had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials whose signatures could transform kidnapping into legal custody, how he had exploited international adoption laws that varied between countries and created loopholes large enough to move children through like cargo. Eli sat in the gallery beside Ranger, his small hand resting on the dog's head while his mother spoke truth to power in words that carried the accumulated weight of every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer, every bureaucrat who had looked through her as if she were invisible rather than a human being whose world had been destroyed by criminals wearing respectable facades. The defendant's guilty verdict came after less than 2 hours of jury deliberation, followed by a sentence that would ensure Thomas Whitman spent the remainder of his natural life in federal prison, where his expensive tastes and cultivated sophistication would be replaced by concrete walls and steel bars that money couldn't unlock. But the real victory wasn't measured in years of incarceration or criminal convictions. It was evident in the small boy who had learned to smile again, whose nightmares were gradually being replaced by dreams where teddy bears had adventures with heroic dogs who barked when silence would have been easier, safer, more convenient for adults who preferred not to hear. Uncomfortable truths about children who needed protection more than they needed quiet. The investigation that began with Ranger's bark in Terminal 4 unleashed a federal avalanche that buried corruption networks across 3 continents, exposing a web of complicity that reached from small-town courthouses in Texas to diplomatic missions in European capitals, where officials had been purchased like office furniture and deployed to legitimize atrocities that defied both international law and basics human decency. Special Agent Rodriguez's task force discovered that Thomas Whitman was merely one tentacle of an operation that had been moving children across borders for over a decade, using sophisticated document forgery, judicial corruption, and bureaucratic manipulation to transform kidnapping into paperwork that fooled customs officials, social workers, and law enforcement agencies who had been trained to look for obvious criminals rather than predators wearing diplomatic immunity. The digital forensics team that analyzed Whitman's encrypted communications uncovered a client list that read like a directory of wealthy individuals who had purchased children like luxury items, paying premium prices for specific characteristics, ages, and backgrounds that satisfied twisted desires dressed up as humanitarian adoption efforts. Among the recovered files were photographs of at least 23 children who had been processed through similar channels, their original identities erased, and replaced with fictional histories that served the convenience of purchasers who viewed childhood innocence as a commodity to be acquired rather than protected. Sarah Chen, age 7, had disappeared from a playground in Seoul and reappeared 18 months later in the custody of a software executive in Silicon Valley whose adoption papers bore the same judicial signatures that had legitimized Eli's kidnapping. Miguel Santos, age 4, had vanished from his grandmother's apartment in Mexico City and was discovered living with a retired diplomat in Switzerland whose extensive art collection included children as well as paintings. The pattern was always the same: vulnerable families from modest backgrounds whose limited resources made them easy targets for institutional indifference, corrupt officials whose signatures could be purchased for the right price, and wealthy clients whose money insulated them from scrutiny that might have revealed the criminal origins of their adopted children. Each case represented years of maternal anguish, countless sleepless nights, and bureaucratic walls that had been erected to protect perpetrators rather than victims. But Ranger's instinctive recognition of fear had begun a domino effect that would eventually reunite dozens of families and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of government agencies that were supposed to protect children rather than facilitate their exploitation. The Belgian Malinois, who had refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier, became the catalyst for international law enforcement cooperation that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, linguistic barriers, and political differences to focus on a simple principle. Children are not commodities to be traded, and those who treat them as such deserve justice that matches the magnitude of their crimes against innocence itself. 3 years have passed since Ranger's bark shattered the illusion of normalcy in Terminal 4, but the echoes of that moment continue to reverberate through law enforcement agencies, courtrooms, and family reunification centers across the globe, where children who had been written off as statistics are being returned to mothers who never stopped believing in the possibility of miracles disguised as German shepherds with sensitive noses and hearts bigger than bureaucratic indifference. The Belgian Malinois now spends his retirement in a suburban Atlanta home where 8-year-old Eli draws pictures of superheroes with 4 legs and capes made of fur, where nightmares have been replaced by dreams of adventures with his canine guardian angel, and where the teddy bear that once served as a shield against horror now rests peacefully on a bookshelf filled with stories about brave dogs and happy endings that seemed impossible during those 73 days of separation. Eli Maro has become an advocate for families whose children disappear into legal grey areas where money speaks louder than maternal desperation. Her testimony before congressional committees and international tribunals, carrying the moral authority of someone who has stared into the abyss of systematic corruption and emerged with unshakable faith in the power of truth to triumph over even the most sophisticated evil. The child protection network that emerged from Whitman's case has revolutionized international adoption procedures, implementing biometric verification systems, real-time database cross-referencing, and canine units trained specifically to detect the psychological stress signatures that accompany human trafficking, disguised as legal custody transfers. But perhaps the most profound change has been cultural rather than procedural. The recognition that children's voices matter even when they speak in whispers, that instinct sometimes carries more truth than documents, and that listening requires more than hearing words. It requires understanding the grammar of fear written in silence and translating it into action that protects innocence rather than enabling its exploitation. Officer Daniel Carter still patrols airport terminals with a new partner, but he carries with him the knowledge that evil often wears expensive suits and speaks multiple languages, that corruption can purchase judicial signatures but cannot silence the conscience of a dog who refuses to ignore suffering, and that sometimes the most important arrests begin not with evidence gathered by sophisticated technology, but with the simple recognition that something is wrong in ways that transcend rational explanation. As night falls over Atlanta's airport, the fluorescent lights continue to hum their mechanical lullabies, while thousands of travelers pass through terminals where trained dogs and alert officers maintain vigilance against predators who continue to exploit systems designed to protect rather than harm the innocent. But in the darkness between departure gates and customs checkpoints, a question lingers like incense in abandoned churches. How many other children are walking through our world in silence, waiting for someone to hear their unspoken screams? And how many heroes with 4 legs and hearts full of justice are we ignoring when they try to tell us that something is terribly, urgently, desperately wrong? And have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.